Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar with Kelly Surtees. Really excited to have Kelly back for a presentation on Saturn through the houses. So thanks for joining us for this one. We're going to have a lot of fun today. As I was saying earlier, if you have questions throughout today's presentation, you can pop those in the Q&A window. But with that, I'll go ahead and turn things over to Kelly and we'll get started.
Thanks so much, Tony, and welcome to all our friends and students in the Astrology University community. It's great to be here and to be back with you all after a bit of a break. We do have a very firm time limit today, so I'm going to try and keep up a pretty consistent pace as we go. My intention with today's webinar is to take you through some of the main themes and concepts of Saturn transiting through each of the 12 houses. So as you can appreciate, we've got 12 different iterations of Saturn transits to get through. I want to make a couple of initial remarks as we get started, and then we'll dive straight into Saturn through the houses. I do have some extra information that if we get time to share towards the end, I will, but our main focus today is to jump into Saturn through the 12 houses. So that's what we'll have a look at. This is part one of a two-part series in Saturn transits webinars that we're running. So part two is coming up next month, where we'll take a look at transit of Saturn to the natal planets. So if you're wondering about transit Saturn to your natal Venus or moon or sun or Mars, I'm going to be covering that in the next webinar. So today, I'm not going to talk about Saturn transiting the planets. We're just going to stay on Saturn transit through the houses. Tony, can you give me screen sharing powers, please?
Yes, happy to.
Thank you.
There we go.
Excellent. Okay. And we shall get this going. Okay, great. This is my first time doing this on this particular computer. So a couple of thoughts and themes to get us going. Saturn transits have some common themes. So you might hear me refer back to some core words or experiences as we go. And I just want to cover them off at the beginning so we set our tone for the day. So Saturn transits can indicate a limit, and that can be the end of something or the recognition that you actually are ready to start something. So when we reach our limit, we can be done or ready to begin. One of the trickiest things with pulling this presentation together today was to try and express as we go through the 12 houses that there can be some positive expressions of Saturn transiting each house, and that there can be some more challenging expressions of Saturn transiting each house. I'm going to try and give you a few when we get into each of the houses. And the reason I do that is that even when I talk with clients, I usually share a few things you might like about this transit, or things this transit is good and productive to be used for. Or there are things I want to let them know that there might be things that they could find difficult or uncomfortable about a particular transit. In my experience working with clients, there's often a mix. We often get, oh yeah, I did get that sort of positive outcome of this Saturn transit. And I also had to deal with this thing that I wish I didn't, or I didn't enjoy doing. So there will be both some positives and negatives to every Saturn transit that we have. The qualities of Saturn, I'm just going to scooch forward to the slide that I'm referencing here, are about coolness and slowness. And often when Saturn transits a house, we need to get still in that part of our lives. So think about the topics of the house that Saturn might be transiting for you, and think about how going slower might help you go better, if you like. Saturn prefers quality over quantity. And one of the common themes you'll notice with Saturn transiting through the different houses is the need to focus on the core things, what really matters about your second house or about your 11th house topics. Not everything. Saturn he's not interested in extracurricular activities or options. He wants you to come back to the main priority. And that's part of the slowing down, so that you have space and time and even energy to contemplate what a core priority should be in this part of our life. Saturn is a planet that usually pushes us into situations or highlights events or experiences where we need to make a choice. We have to definitively say yes to one thing or no to something else. And one of the things I notice clients and students struggling the most with in regards to Saturn is this making of a choice. We don't like to make choices as humans. We like to keep our options open. We like to think that everything is possible. And when we're in a Saturn transit, there's a particular set of topics as defined by the house that Saturn's moving through that we have to make some choices. We have to say no to certain things so that we can actually build the things that matter. Saturn is one of our original outer planets, and Saturn transits through the houses point to longer or more major developments. You're going to have Saturn transiting a particular house in your chart for anywhere from 2 to 3 years. I use the whole sign house system, and I've only got a couple of example charts in today's presentation, but you'll see me use the whole sign house system. In that system, when Saturn changes signs in the zodiac, he's also changing houses in our birth chart. So this idea of Saturn pointing to longer developments or more major things in our life, it's not what am I doing about my finances this week or this month if Saturn is transiting your second house of money, but rather what am I doing about my finances in this lifetime, if you like? How am I managing my cash flow? Am I on top of savings? Have I got some debts from the past that I need to attend to? Saturn transits usually bring up what I call old news, which is the need to deal with things that you've known about for some time but haven't got to yet. There are other types of transits that tend to bring new things into our lives. Saturn transits often highlight the need or the necessity to better manage, organize, or restructure stuff that's been going on that hasn't felt quite right for some time. This restructuring is a big Saturn transit theme where we want to make sure that what we are putting our energy and time into today will continue to provide a benefit for us or build security for us long into the future. Saturn is very interested in preservation and protection. And so when Saturn asks you to consolidate or make choices, what's really going on is that you're being asked to consider what is worth preserving and protecting. You know, if you have Saturn in your third house and there's stuff coming up about sibling relationships, what is worth preserving and protecting in that context? And that's what you have to put your energy into. Because if something is worth preserving and protecting, it usually means we want to create space for something in our lives for the long term, or we need to protect ourselves against something causing us harm or difficulties in the future. So sometimes we have to build fences or repair fences when we're in a Saturn transit to a particular part of our chart. And other times we're in a position where we can build a gate in the fence so we can have some coming through or pathways, if you like. Saturn transits do have this short-term effort for long-term gain quality, where you may not reap the rewards today or this year of your Saturn transit. So you really do want to think of what will give me some sort of benefit or payoff or improvement 7 years from now. I often think about that 7-year time frame with Saturn transits, the quarter cycle. So if transiting Saturn is in your 10th house of career at the moment, think about what could you do now that will give you a professional benefit 7 years into the future? So these are some of the themes we're going to work with. There are 2 points that I want to make about Saturn transits before we dive into the houses. So let's get those up now. The first is that Saturn has a different quality or tone to him, depending on whether you're born in the daytime or in the nighttime. And many of you who've taken my classes and courses before or have studied ancient and Hellenistic astrology will know that I'm talking about the doctrine of sect, which talks about how planets kind of pick up a different piece of their self or their personality, depending on whether it's a daytime chart or a nighttime chart. So if you're born in the daytime and you have the sun above your ascendant descendant axis in the top half of your chart, you're more likely to experience some of the more constructive or productive side of Saturn. If you're born in the nighttime, where the sun is below the ascendant descendant axis, you may find that when Saturn shows up by transit, you're dealing with some of the more classic challenge or difficulty experiences of Saturn. And that's not because, people with night charts are being picked on or anything like that. There's a theory to this, which is that the heat of the daytime helps to warm up and mellow out Saturn. Now, Saturn doesn't become mellow in an absolute sense, but in a daytime situation or a daytime chart, Saturn is a little bit less cool and rigid and stern than he would be in other settings. So we tend to get a slightly more productive or manageable expression of Saturn transits for daytime charts. Whereas if you're born at nighttime, the cool of night intensifies that rigid, kind of bound, stern quality of Saturn. And that's where you can have a little bit more of a tricky experience with a Saturn transit if you're born at nighttime. So all Saturn transits require effort and work, but sometimes we're a little bit more kind of comfortable about what that is when we're a day chart, and it can be a little bit more uncomfortable in a night chart. This is a theory, and so it applies in many instances, but I did want to say it won't apply in an absolute sense in every instance, but it's a good thing to have in the back of our mind as we're getting started here. So the theory says that Saturn transits can lead to more manageable or productive situations and maybe even slightly better outcomes if you're a day chart person. And if you're a night chart person, you might have that more classically difficult or uncomfortable Saturn transit experience because of that coolness, just making Saturn much more stern and rigid in the night chart setting. One of our examples early on, I'm going to show you what this looks like in practice, but this is the theory that we'll take in our toolbox, if you like, as we move forward. The other piece that I wanted to point out is that Saturn does operate differently depending on the signs that he is in. And there are 3 signs that Saturn can be especially constructive or that kind of wise mentor guide figure. And they're the 3 signs that are pointed to with green arrows on the screen here. The signs where Saturn is exalted, so that's down here in Libra. The signs where Saturn is in rulership in the traditional system, which include Capricorn and Aquarius. So there are a couple of different things that we kind of have to layer together here. That Saturn itself is perhaps able to point to more stable or more protective outcomes when it's in a sign where it has rulership or exaltation. And when Saturn is in a sign where it's in detriment or fall, it has this technical definition where there's a challenge quality. And I'm going to highlight those 3 signs. So it's Cancer and Leo, which you can see are opposite Aquarius and Capricorn. They're the signs where Saturn's in detriment. And then also the sign, just trying to move things on the Zoom screen. There we go. The sign of Aries, where Saturn is technically in fall, and that's opposite the exaltation place of Libra. So when Saturn is transiting through the signs of Aries, Cancer, or Leo, when it's in your house in your chart, that is your Aries house, your Cancer, or your Leo house, that's where we're going to see weak spots revealed. The unsteady, inconsistent nature of Saturn in detriment or fall can reveal things that aren't as solid as they should be, or they can show us where more work or effort is needed. So there's a slightly different quality to the experience of Saturn as it transits the houses, depending on what signs it's going through. Now, straight away, you can probably imagine there are a lot of variations and combinations here. And that is true. Some of us, we all have Aries somewhere in our chart, but for some of us, it could be 2nd house of finances or 11th house of friendship or 9th house of wisdom. And so we know that when Saturn comes to that part of our chart, we're going to have to deal with unshaky ground underneath us. And that can add an extra complication as we navigate the topics of that part of our life. Wherever you have the signs of Libra, Capricorn, or Aquarius, when Saturn transits those parts of your chart, you're going to be able to build something that has long-lasting potential that might serve to stabilize or act as an anchoring experience for other parts of your lives into the future. So there are some slightly different expressions of Saturn depending on the sign that he's moving through. So the summary slide here is that when Saturn is transiting a house in your chart and it's in a sign of Libra, Capricorn, or Aquarius, you're more likely to get these stabilizing, building to last experiences, even if it's difficult and requires effort. When Saturn is in Aries, Cancer, or Leo by transit, and then picking up the topics of a certain part of your chart, you might feel that there's more of a pulling apart or coming apart at the seams, because Saturn transits in those signs can reveal what's not firm, what's not strong, what's not built on a solid foundation. When we get that clarity about where there's wonky foundations, then we can shore it up, but it will take more effort and we may not do the building in that point of our journey. So they were just a couple of preliminary points that I have in the back of my mind when I'm working with clients about Saturn transits through the houses. So I wanted to share those with you as we get started. And at this point, I think we should absolutely dive in to our Saturn through the round of the 12 houses, just to make sure we have enough time to say something about each of these as we go. Okay, so we're going to be having a little bit of a contemplative nature because I mentioned that kind of still slowing quality of Saturn. I want you to think about going deep in the topics of the house that Saturn is transiting through. Saturn transit through each of the houses in your chart tend to take you deeper into your experience of that house. If that part of your chart typically works in a very functional way, you have an opportunity to make that already kind of functional even stronger. And if this Saturn transit is going into a part of your chart that you already know there's a few weak spots or stress points around, they will become clearer and require more of your energy as it does. So Saturn kind of helps really intensify and reveal what is already present in the natal chart. Maybe you've suspected for a while that this part of your life doesn't go the way you want. And when Saturn's there, you really see that come to the fore. One way I think about Saturn transits is that they can reveal these fault lines or weak spots. And so when something shows up as a problem as Saturn transits through the houses in our chart, I often see that as, I didn't know that that floorboard had a crack in it or didn't have a good foundation. So let's go and get that sorted now. So that's giving you, I guess, some of my philosophy about how I approach this. What we're going to do now is, on each slide, I actually have written into the text of each slide some of the main points that I find I say time and again when I'm talking about Saturn transit this house or that house. I'm going to share them with you today, build on them a little bit, and hopefully give you a few keywords, concepts, and insights that will help you understand your own Saturn transits through the houses, but also that you can share with others. It won't be possible for me to capture everybody's individual experience of each Saturn through each house transit. Even when I'm working with clients, I'll say this is sort of the main theory, or these are the main experience of this. And the client might share their specific story. And I'll say, wow, I wouldn't have thought to describe it that way, or that's an experience that I haven't encountered or hadn't heard of before. And then I'll say something like, and that is totally congruent with the energy of that wise old serious Saturn around these topics of that house or this house. So the theory takes us part of the way, but we do have to have those chart-based conversations to really get into a lot of the nuances. You can work with Saturn transits through every house in a productive way, even if you're dealing with challenges and difficulties. And hopefully I'll be able to touch on that for each house as we go. One way I think about Saturn transits through the houses is that it's like, where are you ready to work? Where are you ready to go deep? And where are you ready to kind of consolidate? Many of you know that I love to garden. And so I'll often have at different points of the year, it's appropriate to get the big cutting shears out and cut things back. And Saturn transits are very much the cutting things back transit of the zodiac, which is, where do I need to get rid of all this extra filler so that I can remember the rootstock, or I can make space for what really matters. When we just moved back into our home recently, the front garden had really gone a little bit wild. We had a lot of rain in July in Ontario, or this part of southern Ontario. And there were 2 rose bushes that I could barely see in the garden because all the big leafy green plants around them had just grown so much. So I gave them a good prune, pulled out all the weeds, and a month later, those rose bushes that I could barely see are now blooming. They've got flowers on them, which is just amazing. But they wouldn't have been able to do that had they been competing for resources with everything around them. And when we're having a Saturn transit through a house in our chart, we are like those rose bushes where we have to cut back everything else so we get the sunlight, the rain, the resources, the nutrients in the soil to focus on, the purpose of the rose plant, of course, is to make rose flowers. So taking that as our starting point, let's look at transiting Saturn through the first house. When transit Saturn goes through the first house, you are being called to focus on your health, your vitality, and your body. And you might have to do this in a way where I've got a friend here locally who's an Aquarius rising, and they have chosen a new eating protocol for themselves, which has some limits in it, but they're really thrilled about it and they're getting great results. They're a daytime chart person, so they're sort of choosing to work with Saturn and really happy with embracing some of those limits and that restraint. I have another client who a few years ago is a Capricorn rising chart, but a night chart person. And when Saturn was going through their first house, they had a lot of health issues come up that they didn't enjoy, and that required some medical support and intervention and treatment around. And that's an example of a slightly more difficult Saturn in the first house iteration. So in either instance, we have to prioritize the body and the wellness and the physical vitality. What do we need to bring in to support vitality? What do we need to take out? Whether it's a food, a commitment, a lifestyle change or choice, watching TV for a walk around the block or what have you. So there's a very physical, very practical component of transiting Saturn in the first house that brings you back into your body, that kind of reminds you that you have a physical vessel that needs your attention, your care, and your guidance. The other side of the first house, of course, is that it's about identity. And so when Saturn's in the first house, you are redefining your identity. Whether you're doing this for the first time Saturn's transiting your first house, the second or the third time. The transits of Saturn through the houses happen 30 years apart, and you come back to those topics with the new, more wise version of yourself. So the same topics come up, whether you have Saturn in your first house, in your 20s for the first time, and then in your 50s, and then in your 80s, in that it's about identity and health and vitality in the body. But what you deal with Saturn in the first house by transit when you're in your 20s in terms of your body will be different from what you deal with from your physical experience when you're in your 50s or your 80s. The other point of Saturn in the first house is to help you prioritize your personal goals, projects that really matter to you. It's learning to put yourself first. It's figuring out, what does saying no to other people look like so that I can say yes to myself? Sometimes with Saturn in the first house, we get a really kind of clear awareness or insight about the consequences of not putting ourselves first. And that might be that you do get sick, or that you're exhausted because you're doing a lot for your family, or you've got more on at work or with a partner. So Saturn in the first house is very much about kind of being selfish, but in a really healthy, aware way, not in an egotistical way, just in a realistic, well, it is up to me to care for myself or to manage my needs. And I have to do that first before I do anything else. The Saturn in the first house transit does, I think, point to the start of a new journey and a new cycle. So there is this sense of kind of trying to connect with or explore who you are now, at whatever age you happen to be and whatever stage of life you happen to be in when Saturn's in the first house. It's like, how do I really embody the identities that matter to me at this point in my life? Is it your identity as a parent, as a spouse, as a professional, as somebody who's into fitness or who's an expert in something else? We really want to be clear that we are putting our energy and our resources into things we're happy to be known for, or that we're very proud of. So that is really important to think about transiting Saturn in the first. So there's kind of two core topics here: physical health and vitality. What needs to happen to support that? And what do we need to stop doing to support that? And then how do we redefine our sense of ourselves? Now, sometimes we age or we mature when Saturn's in the first house. And that can be part of this need to embrace a slower pace, that maybe you can't do as many things as you used to. Maybe you need more time for yourself and less time for others, and so on. So that's a really special cycle to work with. And, based on how I see it go with clients, sometimes the health focus is, I'm choosing to put my health first now. And in other situations, it's like, well, I have to put my health first because this thing has come up. Because so much of our identity is often tied to our relationships, you can sometimes see major shifts around relationships when transiting Saturn's in the first house, because the Saturn in the first stands by transit is in opposition to the seventh. And there's a natural readjustment that must happen when transit Saturn's in your first house, that if you're going to start putting yourself first more, or you're going to give more time for your personal projects or personal growth and self-development, you will by natural default have less time for other people. And that's absolutely okay and really appropriate when transit Saturn's in the first house. So hopefully that makes sense. I can see a couple of questions here. I'm going to talk about transiting Saturn through every house. So if you've got questions about Saturn in the 7th or Saturn in the 10th, I'll get to those. I'll probably answer those questions just when I get to those houses. The question here about Saturn and Jupiter transiting Saturn and transiting Jupiter being in the same house for many people, that only happens once every 20 years. We are in that part of the cycle right now in 2020 and 2021. Last year, we had transit Saturn in Capricorn with transit Jupiter there. And this year, of course, we have transit Saturn in Aquarius with transit Jupiter there. But that only happens for 2 years out of a longer 20-year cycle. So going forward over the next 18 years, it will be transiting Saturn in one house and transiting Jupiter in another house. So that it happens on a specific cycle, but not as a usual or regular. It's not even the majority of the time. And then regarding the first house, is it things that we would happy to be known for about our whole identity? Yes. So basically, while Saturn's in the first house, you're trying to choose and firm up and even affirm what's important to you going forward. So what's important now, and how am I going to let that feed in to my future? Okay, so let's move to the second house, because of course we want time to talk about all 12. Okay, so transiting, this is an example. This was the Saturn in Capricorn example chart that I mentioned, where we had some of those health issues come up. So if you want more detail on that, you can read that after. So transiting Saturn in the second, this is actually one of my favorite ones to work with clients. And it can be a little more positive or a little bit more challenging, depending on, day chart versus night chart, or is the second house sign in your chart a place where Saturn has some good strength or where Saturn is struggling a little bit. So you can bring those features in. But this is a cycle about growing up or maturing about money. It's basically time to get your financial affairs in order. You might get a reality check about what isn't working financially, but you will also be able to deal with some of the rewards of what you've done well about money in the past. So I have seen clients from both ends of the spectrum, from I've never been good with money and now it's all coming home and coming apart and I need to get on top of it. I had one client very recently who had that situation when Saturn was in her second house, that the kind of financial house of cards that she and her partner had created just sort of fell apart. And she had to go through this big restructuring, get on a repayment plan to get back on top of her finances. But I've also seen clients who have been quite organized and practical and even a little bit cautious with their money. And then transiting Saturn comes to the second house and they're in a position where they can invest, or they can, they have money for a down payment, or they can completely pay off something like their student loans or other obligations that they've been carrying. So you learn a lot about your habits to do with money, about, spending and saving tendencies when Saturn is transiting the second house. You will be kind of encouraged or sometimes pushed into getting a better system for managing or organizing your money when Saturn's in the second house, to look at the numbers or to look at the data. The reason that I think Saturn second house transits can be very productive is that Saturn is a little bit of a kind of a boring fellow, and one in that he just likes things done, in a very steady, simple way. And one of the secrets to being financially stable is that little things done regularly add up over time. And that's exactly how Saturn works. And so if you can kind of get that Saturn wisdom, which is also kind of great financial insight when Saturn's in the second house, you can create some good habits that will benefit you long into the future. So some people will be being more honest about the difficulties in their financial situation when Saturn transits the second, and they can take that responsibility, they can put that energy or that effort quality of Saturn into being honest, being real, and taking action for the future. For other people, this is about saving and investing. It's about getting ahead. It's about protecting your financial future. We might, in either situation, we often deal with limits on our personal spending when transit Saturn's in the second. So sometimes that's, I want to buy a house or save for retirement. So I'm choosing not to go out to dinner this week or not to do this thing in the present. And instead, I'm going to save that money or put it towards my mortgage. Or you're in a situation where you're like, wow, my debt's blown out. I need to get on top of it. I'm going to make extra repayments. And in either way, you're taking money out of your regular spending and putting it towards something of substance that will have a good long-term benefit, whether you've got like something to pay off or something to build. It's often really common that we do some big negotiations around income and about making sure we get paid fairly for what our efforts are worth. So that whole sense of your value in terms of what will the marketplace pay for the skills that you have. Sometimes we're upskilling or retraining. We realize that our skills are only worth X amount in the marketplace, and maybe you'd like to increase your income. And so you put like a 2-year plan in place. Think about transiting Saturn in the second house as a 2-year money improvement cycle or a 2-year income improvement cycle. It'll be a little longer than 2 years, but 2 years is really substantial to help you rework in a way that has those long-term benefits. So hopefully that's making sense for those of you who've had this in the past or having this in the future. Okay, so excellent. Great. I think you've got the gist. The only way, so the idea here is that the things that you can do that have value in the marketplace are kind of connected to the second house, and we get a really true sense of how much they are kind of valued or not when Saturn's in the second. In some more difficult iterations of transit Saturn in the second house, I have seen clients deal with limits or restrictions about income when Saturn's in the second house. So it may be that their industry is going through a slow period, or they can't get the rates that they were hoping to get. And so that containment or restriction of Saturn can show up in that way. The other side of it, in a more positive iteration, is the responsibilities that, or the strength or the resilience that you have within you can become more valuable in the marketplace. So it can go either way. So that's something to think about. And definitely, share your experiences in the chat box if you've had anything along these lines for Saturn in the second. So let's move to Saturn in the third house here by transit. I call this the mental mastery cycle. And this is about really getting our communication skills sorted. It's also about taking responsibility for getting our message across. And I know people think, well, I don't have a business, what do I need to get my message across? But we all communicate every day. We all bite our tongue or share every thought that crosses our mind. And when Saturn goes through the third house, we start to get a better understanding of how to be clear about what's important to us and how to communicate our ideas, our thoughts, and our insights in a way that is going to be effective. I just saw Patricia's just jumped in to say that Saturn is transiting their second house and they just refinanced, I guess, their mortgage or their loan, which is that's exactly Saturn in the second house, which is great because you're doing big, major, you don't refinance your house every year. It's something you would do on a more rare or slower schedule. Okay, back to Saturn in the third. So developing communication skills can be taking a course on conflict resolution. It can be reading some books. It can be talking to other people. So there's a wide variety of ways you could approach that. The other topics that show up when transit Saturn is in the third house is matters to do with siblings. Again, this can be good or bad, depending on what this is normally like for you. If you typically have challenges with siblings, then those challenges might become more difficult, or there might be a very specific thing that you're grappling with a sibling through this particular time. If you typically have good or satisfying experiences with siblings, it may be that there's more of a commitment to build and deepen those relationships. In addition to siblings, the third house is where we deal with sort of formal, well, I should say transiting Saturn in the third can bring up formal contracts, kind of legal or official negotiations, very kind of formal paperwork. So you will sometimes see people dealing with, it could be a business thing or a personal thing, but anything that's at that stage of like the official paperwork piece can be a Saturn in the third house transit. And the other side, which kind of picks up on the brain, the mind, the learning side of it, is the study that we want to apply our brain or exercise our mind. And you will see some people, and maybe you've had this experience yourself, of transiting Saturn in the third house. I'm going to take a course and it's going to run for 2 or 3 years, the whole time that Saturn will transit the third house. And you'll naturally improve your communication skills, but you'll also learn information and perhaps gain mastery around different topics by applying yourself to that structured program while Saturn's in the third. Of course, committing to a longer study program like that would also apply for transiting Saturn in the ninth house. There's a little bit of crossover there. Saturn in the third house by transit is also great for writing projects or editing projects, as well as doing teaching, particularly around basic or introductory skills. So if you've ever wanted to teach something and transiting Saturn's going through your third house, you might dip your toes into teaching from, let's try teaching some of the basics so you can practice what being a teacher might look or feel like for you. So we get a lot of that kind of intellectual energy where Saturn is saying, let's go deeper, let's take more responsibility, let's claim the role of the wise person in this space. And that's where we can get, if you're a master communicator, you might be someone who other people look to for insight and guidance around communication as they go. Okay. A question here about, would children have a tough time in school with transiting Saturn in their third? It's possible that they might find that they're struggling a little bit more with the material, or they need more reflection and review time with transiting Saturn in the third house. So that's a really good question. Yeah, that would be something that if I was working with the parent of a young child, we might say, how are they going at school? The third house, there are some mentions or references to the third house as being like an extra friendship part of the chart in our ancient texts. And one of the things, that young children or even sometimes adults grapple with, it's like not in the, it's just an occasional thing that I see with transiting Saturn in the third, is the social aspect that might go with learning or schooling as well. Okay, so that is Saturn in the third. So Saturn in the fourth, this is a biggie, of course. Maria's saying in the chat that transiting Saturn is in her third in Aquarius, and she's just now started teaching a basic astrology class. Fantastic. That is spot on. Leah's saying that when Saturn was transiting their second house, she decided to leave her job and become a stay-at-home mum. So they had to make their budget work on one income, which took a lot of work. So that's a great example for the Saturn in the second house. Yeah, definitely share any stories you have as we go in the chat, because that'll help. You'll probably all read them more than I will, but it'll be really good to add to your learning. So Saturn in the fourth, this is a biggie. It's now we're into sort of one of the angular houses in the chart. We're going to focus on kind of 3 or 4 primary topics, all under the home and family umbrella. Under the home side of things, transiting Saturn in the 4th house is really going to bring home to you, or help you see clearly, I should say, how suitable your current living situation is for you now and into the future. I see 2 things with transiting Saturn in the 4th. Either we're ready to build and grow our family and we need a bigger home to fit everybody in. We need to think about the family home for the long term and taking the responsibility of either the increased rent or mortgage payment that might go with that. Or I see people who are downsizing, who might be at an older or later stage of life and they have a big home, but they don't need that much space anymore. The other side of it is that sometimes transiting Saturn in the 4th house will highlight that you are overextended on, financially on the home, and that we need to downsize to make it more manageable or sustainable for the long term. Remember that Saturn is all about things that we can keep up for an extended period. So transiting Saturn in the 4th is what is or isn't working about your living situation, and what are affordable or practical changes that we can make that will be better for the next 7 years, at least. The other piece we're dealing with here are changing dynamics within our family. And this goes in both directions. It can talk about matters to do with aging parents that require more care, or that you have to take on responsibility for their circumstances a little bit more. It can have to do with children starting to contribute more or taking on responsibility around the home. So that's what I mean. It can go up to your parents or down to your children if that's a feature for you. And we're going to have some stuff come up about our family of origin. So when transiting Saturn goes through the 4th, we do need to take some time and make a bit of space to reflect on our family of origin experiences, whether they were great or whether they were really terrible. Because when transiting Saturn goes through the 4th, we have an opportunity to put an end to long-running patterns, or to put those fences, those boundaries and protections in place, so that what's been difficult about family of origin stuff doesn't continue to cause problems or causes fewer problems in the future. Transiting Saturn in the 4th is also a cycle that's generally associated with endings. And sometimes I will see people go through major career endings, like retirement or stepping out of a long-running role. And when you learn about the 4th house and you're like, what does endings have to do with it? It's not usually something we deal with from a natal perspective with the endings in the 4th, but you do see it often with transiting Saturn in the 4th, that something is coming to an end and something needs to be released so that we can kind of settle into a more solid foundation for the future. The 4th house, I see this conceptually as the base of it's the belly, or the base of your being, if you like. And so we really need to make sure that's as secure and safe for us as possible when Saturn's in the 4th by transit, because everything that happens in the next 30 years is built upon that, if you like. So hopefully that helps give a few thoughts about there. And then a lot of these interpretations would also apply when transiting Saturn is conjunct the IC. For those of you who do work with the whole sign house system, you'll know that the IC isn't always or necessarily in the 4th house itself. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Okay, so now here we go. This is a very quick example of a client who has Aquarius 4th house. They are currently in the process of buying their first home, which is a building project. There are some complications with that, so it's requiring a lot more effort than they expected, but the end result is going to be their dream long-term home. And that's a very classic example of like a productive or a kind of good Saturn 4th house transit. It's not, we don't get anything kind of easy or for free with transit Saturn, but we do get the results that are kind of commensurate with the effort we've put in. They're also working through some legacy matters to do with their family ancestry and with the Indigenous connection within their family. So there's a lot of that family of origin material coming up for them as well. Okay, Saturn into the 5th house. And this is, of course, one of those cycles that feels a little bit odd or funny, because it's like this is supposed to be the house of joy and pleasure, and Saturn is so serious. So in one of the best outcomes, this is about committing to joy and pleasure into your life. So making a schedule or a plan so that you can have more joy and leisure time. But many of us do experience the restriction of Saturn here, that we would like to have more joy and leisure, but we actually can't because we have duties that might be interfering with or preventing that. Matters to do with children and fertility will definitely be highlighted. And I do see some clients go through quite a big journey to do with fertility, whether it's conception, whether it's health through pregnancy. These can all be things that are highlighted as priorities that need to be cared for with transiting Saturn in the 5th. One thing I see a lot if you are a parent who already has children in your life is that it's about what I call the transfer of responsibility, that it's time for children, whether they're 5 or 15 or 35, that it's a giving back, so that the parent says to the child, you know, I've always helped you with this, but now I would like you to try doing it for yourself. Whether it is putting the clothes in the laundry hamper, helping prepare a meal, managing their own cell phone bill, or other things that we might do for our adult children. So limits with children is something we have to be the parent about when we are dealing with transiting Saturn in the 5th. So sometimes it feels a bit like tough love, but it's very appropriate to say, why don't you have a go and let's see what happens, rather than me doing for you. The 5th house is like another place in the chart that can have a little bit to do with romance and that kind of fun relationship energy. And with Saturn there, we can start to want like more of a serious or substantial experience in that regard. Saturn will definitely bring up the quality, not quantity piece of our romantic interludes, if you like. So we may not have as many lovely encounters and experiences, but we're going to focus on the quality, you know, really having that time and that presence, or focusing on, you know, meeting people that are of substance and not tolerating, you know, being disrespected or not being treated well by the people around us. I'm just keeping an eye on the time. I'm going to try and spend just a minute less on each house as we go forward to make sure we stick with our schedule today. The Saturn in the 6th house cycle, this is what I call the apprenticeship cycle. It's actually, weirdly enough, a cycle that can be really productive. We're often learning or practicing new skills and talents when transiting Saturn's in the 6th. This is like going on to a new project at work or having a new role in your career where you don't quite feel you've got it yet, and you're probably not yet earning to your full potential, but you're putting that diligent, consistent effort in each day. And once transiting Saturn pops into the 7th house, that earning potential tends to improve. I never read that in a book. I've just seen that happen time and time again with clients. And so don't lose hope when transiting Saturn is in the 6th house, because it can feel a little bit like Groundhog Day, where we're going through kind of the same routine, but think about it as that apprenticeship, that sort of discipline and that devotion to the craft of whatever it is you're trying to get better at, or just make sure you're doing in a really consistent way. Of course, the 6th house has a few other topics associated with it, the health and the body in a way that could be difficult or challenging. This is where we can commonly see a health concern pop up, or something with our physical health requiring more effort, more time, and more attention. Saturn definitely has the mindset or the point of view that prevention is better than the cure. And so with transiting Saturn in your 6th house, I would definitely encourage you to think about What are those consistent things that I can do regularly that will be good for my health? Maybe not today, but in the future. And that's Saturn. You know, we do the exercise today. Maybe you love it, maybe you don't, but you know that doing the exercise today means as you get older, you're going to keep mobility and you're going to keep flexibility rather than trying to do it once you get to that later stage of life. Okay. So that's something to think about. The other topic, because the sixth house has this weird combination of topics, the pets are also there as well. So the care and well-being of any animals in your care. Now, large animals like horses are typically connected to the 12th house, but sort of more regular domestic animals, if I can say that, like dogs or cats or rabbits or birds, the things that you might keep as a beloved pet within your home, they would definitely be sixth house. And with transiting Saturn there, you might be having to either have good routines and limits with your pets, or you might be dealing with a matter pertaining to a pet in your life. We've got somebody here saying that their sixth house transit began for them in March of 2020, and they really devoted themselves to their astrology training then, but they also had a very severe shingles attack, viral attack in their ear. So we kind of see that we get a bit of both. Sometimes students are like, well, which is it going to be? And often it is, well, it's quite likely that you'll have a little bit of everything. Sometimes one theme dominates more than the other, but it's usually a mix. And Terry's saying, yes, Saturn in the sixth for her and all of those things. The only other topic I haven't said out loud, but that's in the notes and I do want to mention, matters to do with staff, employees, colleagues, or co-workers can also come up. So if you run a business and you have staff or you have employees or people that you're managing, there might be stuff going on with those people in your life, or with people that might be peers of yours or co-workers. And so you might have to set good boundaries and make sure everybody's pulling their weight, or everybody is following through on what they need to do. So you might be having to kind of manage people a little bit more with transiting Saturn in the sixth. Christina's saying that when Saturn was in her sixth house back in the 90s, they fostered some cats, which makes complete sense. Taking on more responsibility for a creature like a cat, which is absolutely a sixth house being, if you like. So there you go. Megan was saying that Saturn through the sixth was also their Saturn return, and they got promoted at work. So being handed more responsibility or a new title, which is a very positive Saturn thing, but it's a new role to her and the organization. Oh, beg your pardon. I've just got two comments confused. The promotion at work, which was totally new, and then they were working 10 to 12 hours a day. And Megan saying it was a difficult few years, but they got through it. And I imagine, and Megan, jump back in and let us know, that as a result of that couple of years, like, were you able to establish a good role or reputation for yourself that you could build on in the future? Or did you kind of get to the end of that transit and be like, I'm a bit burnt out, I have to kind of do something different? I'm always curious. So there you go. Roommate issues would be fourth house, because they have to do with our living situation. So you don't have to live in a sort of typical, partner, parent, child dynamic. Whoever shares your home, whether it's flatmates or whoever it happens to be, that would all be fourth house. And Megan saying, yes, still very respected at work, which is great. Okay, so we've got through our first 6 houses, and now we're going to turn our attention, to the next 6 houses as we go. Saturn transits through the 7th house. There's a lot. I mean, this tends to be a little bit more focused on how we deal with other people. So relationship stuff is quite big with transiting Saturn in the 7th house, which will be no surprise at all. Serious and substantial relationships. So we are not wanting to do fluffy relationship stuff. So if you're involved with someone who's unreliable, inconsistent, or doesn't have respect for you, that's going to really be tested and might come apart under a transit of Saturn in the 7th. So with transiting Saturn in the 7th, it's about the work or the effort of partnership. It's about exploring or defining commitment, who or what is worth prioritizing. And we learn a lot about our own unconscious definition of partnership and commitment when Saturn transits the 7th. And if we're in a primary relationship, so if we have our person or if we're married, it is going to really draw your focus into that space. Now, there's two typical expressions that I see with transit Saturn in the 7th. One is that it does reveal a fault line or a weak spot within the primary partnership that requires attending to. How will we communicate about that? How will we address it? We're going to spend more of our time and our energy trying to either repair or rebuild there. Now, sometimes for those of you who've been in long-term relationships, our relationships can go on for a long time as they are. Maybe it's a bit wonky, but it still works. And then Saturn comes along and it's like, how could we make this wonky bit not wonky? And are we both interested in the engagement with each other and the deepening of our trust and commitment to do that? So there are some very useful constructive things of transit Saturn in the 7th. But of course, transiting Saturn through the 7th, if it reveals a really big weak spot, there may be questions that come up about, can we navigate or overcome this, or even should we? So some couples do come to that, edge of stay together or not, but it's not every case. So for some relationship or Saturn 7th house transits, it's very much about the primary relationship that you're in. In other instances, it's not so much about the two of you against or with each other, but it's about the two of you against the world. And what that can mean is sometimes it's a problem that comes up in the external circumstances around one or both people in the couple, and they kind of come together to deal with this particular pressure or challenge for the length of that Saturn transit in the 7th house. The other extra piece to keep in mind is that if you have a romantic partner, transiting Saturn in the 7th can describe a period in time where your partner has more stress or pressure on them, where there's nothing wrong with your bond together, but they're under pressure at work, or they've got a stressful thing with their family, and they may not be able to show up for you as they normally do because their attention is kind of necessarily elsewhere. So that's another way this shows up. If you are single when transiting Saturn shows up in your 7th house, it can really help you clarify the pros and cons of partnership and decide if this is something you want to put more effort into trying to create for yourself. And we often have this kind of like being in dating or relationship school experience when transit Saturn's in the 7th. Like, how do I do this? What are ways that I could do relationships that might be healthier or more sustainable for me? So, of course, the way you experience transit Saturn in the 7th is going to have a lot to do with your relationship status, if you like, as that planet gets there. And there are very dramatic examples from both sides of the situation that I'll just share two very quick ones. The chart of Adele. Many of you probably know Adele. She's got a great voice, sung a few songs, had a few popular hits. She separated from her spouse in April of 2019 when transiting Saturn was in Capricorn, actually just about to station retrograde in her 7th house. And they were officially divorced with all the paperwork done in March of 2021, by which time Saturn was in Aquarius in the 8th house. I wanted to put this example in because it shows the development of things. For any of you who have been through a separation or divorce, or who have counseled and worked with people going through that, it takes time. Even if you decide to separate, there is often at least 12 months, sometimes longer, from the decision to separate or the moving out of one person to the documents are done and your legal status has changed to divorced. And Adele's chart's a great example of the Saturn in the 7th, maybe revealing some of the fault lines or the challenges in the romantic relationship, and then that leading to separation, and then the divorce itself taking a couple more years, but interestingly enough, being finalized while transiting Saturn's in the 8th house, which has a lot to do with redefining shared assets. So that's just an interesting sneak peek of the house we're about to do. But There are other examples. I know for me, when transiting Saturn was in my 7th house, I met the person who became my spouse. So that's when I met my husband. I didn't marry him then, but that's when I met him. It's when I moved to Canada. And then another sort of public example is Gloria Steinem, who was an older bride. She would have been in her early 60s. And she got married when transiting Saturn was in Taurus in her 7th house in the year 2000. So there, transits of Saturn, I wanted to show it can be separation and it can be marriage, or it could be meeting your person. So you can get both extremes, basically. But the key here is major relationship kind of restructuring. So those pivotal experiences that change your understanding of relationships and of partnership and commitment. Okay, I feel like we could probably do a whole webinar on transit Saturn in the 7th house, but of course I want to make sure we honor all the other houses as we go today. So another very practical transit is transiting Saturn going through the 8th house. So transiting Saturn in the 8th, this is going to bring up money, but it's not about your income so much anymore, but about things like your taxes, any debts that you have, large assets, retirement savings, long-term investments. The 8th house is in that part of the chart that has to do with, we say other people's money. What that actually means in practice and in the consultation room is your partner's money, if you have a romantic or a business partner, because either of those, business partner or romantic partner is covered by the 7th house. And so the money of either of those people is 8th house. But it also means family finances, and that usually means inheritances. Now, many of us may not inherit anything financially from our parents, but you will deal with clients who are managing inheritance matters. And with transiting Saturn in the 8th, it can be a variety of things, from the parent dies, the will is read, the client receives money. That's a very straightforward thing. But just as often, you'll hear things like, my parent died 5 years ago and I'm still in court with my siblings, or we're still trying to figure out because my parent had multiple spouses, for instance. And the Saturn in the 8th house can be the formalizing or the finishing of that ongoing process of dealing with a family financial matter or an inheritance. So with the 8th house, I always see that there's that very practical money side. And you can even see in the notes here, there's a second side to the 8th house. And this is the psyche side, the psychological, emotional, inner space side of the 8th house. And it's equally important when Saturn's in the 8th house that we do this, as much as we need to attend to some of those major money things. Somebody mentioned this earlier when we were talking about Saturn in the 2nd house. It's about restructuring. So if you already have a mortgage, but you think it needs to be refinanced, or you want to consolidate some other debt into your home, that's a Saturn 8th house thing. Maybe you've got a pension or a retirement plan and you're trying to figure out the best way to work that, should you start it at this age or that age? That's all Saturn 8th house thing. But the psyche side of it, the psychological side, it is about healing from the past with transiting Saturn in the 8th. And some of us will do that on our own with our own internal reflection work. And others of us will seek out a healer or a therapist to work with us on those things. So Saturn in the 8th house by transit can sometimes really create the right setting, or even the internal recognition that you're ready to address some of the difficult topics, maybe within yourself or within your life. So there's a real internal exploration that we do with transiting Saturn in the 8th house. And for those of you who see clients, part of your client's experience with that might actually be coming to the astrology consult because they're trying to understand their motivations, their behaviors, why they are the way they are, or how did they get to this place in their life, whether they like the things about their life right now or whether they're struggling and dealing with some challenges. But the 8th house is going to take us inwards in the same way that the 12th house does, into our internal landscape. And so transiting Saturn the 8th says, let's go in for this 2 to 3 year period, sort out, heal, resolve, make peace with some of the stuff that's a bit congested and stuck inside us. And once we do that, We're ready to come out into the world in a new way. And that's Saturn into the ninth house by transit. So Saturn into the ninth house is about connecting with a path of wisdom in any particular capacity. And so wisdom pathways are ninth house. And what that means is there a particular philosophy or teacher or mentor or guide that you're ready to perhaps devote yourself to? Maybe it is that you are ready to become a guide or a teacher or a mentor for others. So transiting Saturn in the ninth is about acknowledging the wisdom within, making space for it in your everyday life. And for some of us, it is about choosing to share that with others. So it's about the discipline or the discipleship, about following your faith or the things that you believe in. For some, it's about choices regarding religious or spiritual practices. I've outgrown this religious or spiritual practice and I need to look for something different. Or I've been feeling for a while like this is lacking in my life and I want to make it a priority. So we can get both sides of it. At a slightly more kind of earthly practical level, transiting Saturn in the ninth can also be about the sharing of accumulated knowledge or wisdom or experiences that you have gained thus far in your life. And that sharing can happen through teaching, through publishing, through writing, through putting stuff on YouTube, any kind of publication platform we might be wanting to explore with Saturn in the ninth. The ninth house is, of course, about global matters. And from your personal experience, transiting Saturn in the ninth will create some extremes of either all about doing lots of travel or limits and doing no travel. And I've seen, again, both of those with clients where I've had some clients say, normally I travel internationally a lot, but I'm not at the moment, or I haven't for a few years. And we see the limit of Saturn containing or holding them. And then there are other clients who perhaps never travel internationally or don't take those special trips, which are the definition of a ninth house adventure. And when Saturn shows up, it's like, this is my once in a lifetime trip to go to this place of some kind of spiritual or philosophically significant location. From a business or study perspective, Saturn in the ninth house can show that there are now international affiliations or opportunities, that you might be dealing with an international or global connection within your business or around a study opportunity. So it's about finding ways to connect out in the world, whether that's through the mental sort of travel of learning and taking in information, or the challenge of how do I share the knowledge that I have. Or whether it's the physical, grab the passport and go. And of course, the external circumstances apply. We're recording this webinar in early 2021, where there are still a number, while travel is more now than it was last year, there's still a number of restrictions and very Saturnian rules and regulations about what you can do travel-wise and where you can and can't go. So Saturn, if you're having transiting Saturn in the ninth house at the moment, that's going to be playing into that as well. So that is one way to think about this. I can see there's a bunch of questions there. And at this point, I think I'm going to just try and get through my material, and we should have a few questions, a time for a little bit of questions at the end. So if we haven't got to your questions yet, just hold steady. So Saturn in the 10th. So this can be, in the positive side, this is like a crowning experience, the success, fame, honors, and achievement. Your hard work of the past pays off, and other people, your industry, within your field, recognize the wisdom, the gravitas, the experience, the expertise that you bring. Now, in the more difficult experience, it's realizing that you're not going where you'd like to go professionally. So in most cases, there's a level of the wisdom and experience that you have gained or built up starting to gain recognition in the environment around you. Other people might call on you to step into leadership positions or positions of increased responsibility. You may not feel ready, but if these opportunities show up, they're really good to look forward to and to reach for if transiting Saturn is in the 10th. It's often a time, whether you're dealing with, the fame and honors, or you're dealing with the recognition that you're not going where you'd want to go professionally, it's a great time to think about that contract and consolidate, like professionally? What is it that I most want to do with my work in this lifetime or in this world? And how can I get rid of anything in my professional scope right now that isn't that primary purpose? And so that can be where the culling and the pruning comes in. I've been doing these bunch of different things, but I really love these two things. So I'm going to stop doing all these extra things and just do these pieces. Now, if you work for yourself, that's a little bit easier to do. But if you work for an organization, you may have to negotiate with your boss or your peers about how you can narrow your focus. This is a cycle of specialization, if you like. There are other cycles or transits through the 10th house that encourage you to, be the kind of jack of all trades and the master of none. But transit Saturn in the 10th is more about narrowing and focusing on fewer things. Some of us will feel that very classic Saturn in the 10th pressure of there's extra responsibility at work. Maybe your boss is AWOL, or your organization is working on this really big project that's got a lot of financial potential for the company, but everybody has to work harder to see if we can get that done. So there can be more of that kind of heavy lifting or that pressure in regards when this cycle is going on. So that's something to have a think about for this. One other point I want to make is that a lot of these themes of transiting Saturn in the 10th house will also apply when transiting Saturn conjuncts the midheaven. And so if the midheaven is in the 9th or the 11th, you want to add in some of these themes for that transit. And when Saturn, and this next piece that I'm going to say is specific to Saturn in the 10th house only, transiting Saturn in the 10th house creates what's called the overcoming position to the first house. And that can put pressure on us personally or physically as we try to get ahead professionally. So that transiting Saturn in the 10th house might have this sense of, yes, there are opportunities at work, but it might be causing some friction or a little bit of irritation for your health, your wellness, or something in your personal life. So we just want to think about that. There's a very special relationship that Saturn in the 10th has to the first. That's why I wanted to just briefly mention that. Some of you will be very familiar with that concept, and some of you won't, and that's totally okay. We'll work with that in question time if we can. So transiting Saturn in the 10th is about coming to some sort of peak or top where your professional achievements are concerned, and then wanting to enjoy what you've worked hard for, but make sure that you have a sense of why you're doing what you're doing, as well as that pruning, which is good. So hopefully that gives you some clarity on that one. And we're doing great today, team. I think we're going to get through our material with a few minutes left. Victoria's saying she really resonated to that Saturn overcoming piece just on the 10th, where with transiting Saturn in the 10th, she felt that any professional success was unfortunately at the expense of her mental health. And that can be one of the challenge pieces of Saturn in the 10th. Great for career, tough for the body, tough for the mind. Okay, Saturn in the 11th. This is about friendships, and it's often about getting really clear on who the quality friends and friendships are that you want to treasure. And of course, I'm in the garden, so I'm like, well, we're going to water these ones and make sure they get sunlight. But transiting Saturn in the 11th is also about who is not a true friend or who is not a valuable association to keep. And therefore, we might want to start distancing or protecting ourselves against those people. So when the Saturn goes through the 11th, there's friendships, there's group and organization commitments, and there's community involvements that we want to be reassessing, reviewing, and streamlining. So there's two things. If you're already doing a lot in these areas, Saturn in the 11th comes along and says, let's pare back, let's simplify. If you're not doing anything on the groups, organization, community involvement front, and transiting Saturn comes to the 11th, you may want to pick one thing to give some time or energy towards. So sometimes we need to delegate and step down from extra organizations or community plans and projects that we're in. If we're doing too much when transiting Saturn comes along, And if we're not doing anything, we might pick just one thing. Saturn's quality, not quantity. So just one thing. The key here is that we want to improve the quality of the experiences we're having, whether it's with friends or with this community project. And to do that, we want to make sure that we're just doing a couple of things that are really manageable for us. So major changes with friendships can happen with transiting Saturn in the 11th house. Now, transiting Saturn in the 12th, some of you will be having this now and really connecting to the archetype of the hermit, the idea of wanting more time alone or wanting to step back. In the 12th house, when we say it's the place of retreat, we want to withdraw from all the other things that we're normally doing. And when transiting Saturn's in the 12th, which is where Saturn has its joy, we really want to embrace these kind of limits or this quality of less. It's great if you can choose it for yourself. Sometimes it shows up that external circumstances change, and that's what happens. But we're very inward, very in our own space, and we need extra energy and extra time for that inner reflection. We really need to get quiet, get still, and go within. So there's a quality of withdrawal or like absenting yourself or even like a vanishing. I'm just not going to be around as much, whether it's friends or family or co-workers that you normally go out socializing with. Saturn in the 12th is like, I'd rather just go home and read a book or sit quietly, maybe meditate. For some people, transiting Saturn in the 12th has a productive quality, and it's usually in the context of working solo or working behind the scenes. So this working out of sight or not being seen is a very 12th house thing. The main themes with Saturn in the 12th is that it's so much about going within. It's so much about connecting with some of your fears, your worries, some of the stuff that's like proverbially been shoved under the carpet. We'll deal with that later. And Saturn comes into the 12th house and it's like, what's under there? What have I not looked at? What have I not addressed? There's a little bit of clearing the past here. And I think there's a lot of healing that we do with transiting Saturn in the 12th. But to do that, we sometimes have to revisit some of the more difficult things or pain points in our lives so that we can come to a place of less rigidity around them. Whether you can heal or forgive or accept, it's possible, sometimes not always, but to at least be more familiar with that interior landscape. So laying low, more rest, time apart, time alone. If you can embrace that when transit Saturn's in the 12th, then you're recharged and ready for that redefining cycle that happens as Saturn moves back into the first house 30 years on from where he was before. If Saturn in the first is the beginning of a cycle, Saturn in the 12th is going to be the ending or the conclusion, the releasing of what's gone before. Sometimes we need integration time. We need to process things that have happened in the recent or the distant past. And that's what Saturn in the 12th can be really helpful with. So that is our big journey around, team. I can see lots of questions and comments coming through. Let me make just a couple of summary points and then we'll take some questions. I want to make one brief point here about Saturn conjunct the angles. So the four angles, the ascendant, the midheaven, the descendant, and the IC, they're four of arguably the most sensitive and powerful points in your chart. So anytime transiting Saturn is conjunct one of those angles, you're going to have a major pivot and reassessment of priorities in your life. It'll be a big developmental stage for you. You will notice some of those themes continue anytime Saturn is in the same sign as the angular point itself. But the main point is when Saturn is on the degree of any of those angles. So just keep that in mind as you're processing and working through the material here. We touched on this a little bit as we went, but you can think about, the main time where those first house themes are going to come up is when Saturn is conjunct the ascendant. And the main time when some of those descendant relationship themes are going to come up will be when Saturn is conjunct the descendant. And we touched on that with the 10th and 4th house and talked about how that's important for the midheaven and the IC as well. I'm not going to do any example charts because I did a couple as we went, and I know many of you are going to have lots of questions. So just to do some summary points here, we talked about Saturn transits helping reveal more of what's normally going on in the house. So the good gets better, and the kind of challenging can get a little bit more intensely difficult. And that will allow whatever repairs to be done or new progress and foundations to be built. Saturn transits can take things to extremes. And so you want to be aware of that. I'm going to extremely go into this part of my chart. And the goal is to strengthen, to fortify, to preserve, and to protect. The other piece here is that Saturn transits are really about helping you get firm and focused. These are about how we simplify in our life, how we get to identify who or what really matters. There's a lot of this long-term versus short-term. And when you're in a Saturn transit, I'd encourage you to prioritize the long-term first, that it might be easier or more satisfying to get that immediate, yes, I did this. But when Saturn's around, we want to think about the long term and what's going to feel good years from now. Sometimes to do that, we have to develop our inner resilience or strength. We have to get better at self-regulation so we can contain that sort of impulse for the now, and we can channel that into efforts for the future. So embrace the idea of quality taking time to create. If you want to build something that lasts, you want to build it slowly and properly, so that it is solid. There's a great quote from Maya Angelou, when you know better, you do better. Sometimes a Saturn transit can highlight an issue from the past, and maybe we sort of think, I didn't handle that as well as I could, or now I've got this problem today because of this thing in the past. So forgive yourself for when you did the best you could, because that was all you knew, and use the wisdom of Saturn to help you gain the knowledge and insight to have a more sustainable plan for the future. Saturn will always bring a really clear, I don't think we talk about the clarity that Saturn transits can bring enough. And so when you see what works well and what doesn't, you've instantly got solutions in front of you. Do more of what works and less of what doesn't. That can be easy to say and hard to do, but at least if you have a blueprint, you're better off than if you didn't have that at all. Think about what's sustainable for the long term. If you can't keep up with your schedule, your duties, or your pressures, it's probably not sustainable. And that's where the consolidation and the paring back of Saturn transits is going to be really important for you. I love this very simple point about Saturn transits as a time to get still, slow down, and be selective. Saturn transits are not the time to do everything, but to do one or two things and do them really well. Use your Saturn transits to secure your foundations, to firm up what's underneath you. The more solid that is, the more success or stability or satisfaction you can build, and the longer it will last. Overall, Saturn transits are really designed to help you build things, choose things, prioritize things that your future self will be thankful for. So you can think about, I'm going to give myself, at 30 or 50 or 70 a gift, and that gift is going to be good health or a great group of friends or good financial security. And I'm going to do that now by this small thing that I'm going to do each week or each month. And I'm going to do it for a long time. Saturn knows that the long time counts. And so he's trying to help you see that what you do today can have a really good impact for you in the future. The final quote that I want to finish on is one from Brené Brown. It's a little bit about boundaries, and it really speaks to this piece about the need to kind of build those fences so that with Saturn, you can kind of take care of what's really important for you as a priority. And that's the message of Saturn. And this quote is, daring to set boundaries is about having the courage to love ourselves even when we risk disappointing others. And I think this is something that every Saturn transit kind of asks or invites us, which is, can you love yourself so much that you do the thing that is going to be most sustainable and most safe for you, even if it means somebody else doesn't get what they want? And if you can work yourself into that, I think that's going to help you with every Saturn transit that you have. So team, thank you for joining me on this tour of Saturn. I know we've got some questions, so let's take a few of those, Tony.
Great. Thanks, Kelly. That was awesome. And yeah, I handled quite a few of them. So if you asked a question, you can see some of those responses by text in the answered column. But this first one, Kelly, is from Ellen, who asks, is it true when Saturn hits the top of the chart and starts to go through the 11th and 12th house, that life gets slower and or tougher? And after Saturn hits the fourth and starts to go up, that you're getting more successful or happier?
That's a really great question. There is a theory that there's like a building energy that we have in our lives when Saturn is moving from the fourth house up to the 10th. And then there is like a sharing or giving back energy that kicks in when Saturn's around the 10th and coming down. But I don't know that I would say it in quite these words. So Saturn going through the 11th I don't think that that's necessarily a lot tougher. I think Saturn in the 12th can be a little bit uncomfortable. And Saturn in the fourth, I've seen clients really have to do some deep internal stuff with Saturn in the fourth. So I think maybe in hindsight, they might be happy that they've done that, but I don't know that that would make them happy in the moment. Yeah.
I can vouch for that one, Kelly.
Yes, you concur, Tony. Yeah. So I think, Saturn is ultimately trying to help us build successful, stable things. So that there's maybe an element in that question that I would agree with, but there's some that I probably wouldn't.
Thanks, Kelly. Rita asks, wherever Saturn is transiting through a house, do you also pull in some of the themes of the house of Saturn's natal position?
Not necessarily. I think the main, like Saturn is bringing a new energy to the topics of the house that it's in. And that's not usually going to have a connection to your natal Saturn stuff. So it could be, but I wouldn't rely on it to do that.
Great, thanks for that. And of course, Rita, if Saturn is transiting through a house where it's making an aspect to natal Saturn, that might bring in that topic. But otherwise, Kelly's just working with Saturn being in that house. Anything you want to add technically to that little piece, Kelly?
I think like if transiting Saturn is going through your 11th house and you've got something to do with a friend and you have natal Saturn in the second house, it may or may not have to do with money, but it definitely has to do with setting limits with your friend. Yeah.
While you're in the 11th house, Daisy asked
Yes.
if you think of social media in the 11th, and if so, do you think it's a good time to start a business project related to social media when Saturn's in the 11th?
I don't know that I would say social media is the 11th house per se, but I think the 11th house is about where we connect with different groups of people. So like being involved in a Facebook group would be an 11th house type thing. And so you might want to commit more energy or effort to that when transiting Saturn is in the 11th. Yeah, it depends what you're doing on social media. If it's to connect with a group, then it's an 11th house thing. If it's to broadcast a message, then it could be a third house thing. And if it's to teach, it could be a 9th house thing. So that's how I'd say that. Yeah.
Thanks, Kelly. Tina says, for the 6th house, what about board and service work or volunteer work? I think that factors in here, not always related to career, but maybe a passion project or purpose work.
Yeah, this is a great question. And this is where I wanted to have some question time because some of these nuances are great to explore. I think board work or volunteering or service work, I often see that a lot as an 11th house thing in terms of connecting with community, giving back, if you like. So it could come up with 6th house. It can sometimes also be 12th house if part of the board or volunteering work is to support those that are suffering. So it's a possibility, and in some charts where there are certain signs or maybe other planets in the 6th, that would be more likely to say something along those lines.
Thanks, Kelly. And Sarah asked about the effect of transiting Saturn and how to think about the houses that Saturn rules in the chart as Saturn is transiting. And would you think of the effects on the houses that Saturn is ruling, even if it's not present in those houses?
Okay, so do the effects of Saturn on the houses apply when? Sorry. So basic is this the question here, Sarah H. Tony?
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's see. The topic. So if Saturn, let me think about this. Okay, I'm just twisting this around a different way. The quality of transiting Saturn, usually by sign, so the detriment, fall, rulership, exaltation piece, will have a flow-on effect back to the natal houses that Saturn rules. So if transiting Saturn is in Libra, for instance, where Saturn's exalted, that can help Saturn do a better job of managing the topics of the Capricorn and Aquarius houses in the chart. If transiting Saturn's in the sign of Cancer, Saturn's a little off his game, and that could highlight some weaknesses in the houses in the chart ruled by Saturn. So you can add these pieces in, but don't forget the main meal, the main course is Saturn affecting the topics of the house that it's transiting through. That's the main part. But if you've got that and you've spent 10 minutes doing a detailed interpretation with your client on that, then you can add in these extras.
Thanks, Kelly. Q of Swords says, how does transiting Saturn compare in flavor to natal Saturn in day or night
sect?
Does transiting Saturn act similar to
natal Saturn, depending on
sect?
Yeah, I don't necessarily think that there's a huge relationship between natal Saturn and transiting Saturn. I know we often want to try and tie them together, but they're actually two totally different things, totally different things. And so the sect of your chart, whether your day or your night, determines whether you get that slightly more productive version of Saturn or you get the slightly more difficult version of Saturn. And so that is the key, I think, I think we touched on this at the very start of the presentation, that if you're a day chart Saturn, you'll get a bit more of a productive or getting to good outcomes. And if it's night chart, it's a little bit more of like, here's the kind of tricky thing I have to manage at this point.
Thanks, Kelly. Patricia asked, do you agree that Saturn often represents fears we may use to stop us from growing and experimenting with opportunities because we're afraid? And if so, can we expect our fears to be part of the challenges and clarity when it transits our various houses?
That's a great question. Yeah, Saturn is definitely fear for sure. So the extent to which our fears stop us, and that's more relevant for some of us than others, and it's more relevant around some topics than around other topics. So I think, yeah, the fear is a part of it, and sometimes that's why we need more time with a Saturn transit. Even if an opportunity shows up when Saturn transits a house in our chart, we sometimes have to navigate our fears, our insecurities, what we're afraid of before we can meet that opportunity. And the quote or the motto that I like to say, keep in mind for that, is feel the fear, but do it anyway. You know, if you get a great professional opportunity when Saturn's in your 10th or conjunct your midheaven, you might be really scared about taking that opportunity, but don't let that prevent you, because the growth that you have from going through it is really rich growth. But yes, I do agree that Saturn is there will be managing fears is part of that.
Thanks, Kelly. And Tina asked if you could say something about Saturn's transit when it's making its return. So Saturn return transit. And
yeah, so when transiting Saturn is back in the same house that natal Saturn is in. Yeah.
Yeah, she's just asking how it might differ from any other Saturn transit.
Yeah, this is a great question. So when transiting Saturn is in the same sign and house that your natal Saturn is in, it is a reactivation of your lifelong Saturn stuff, if you like, for better or for worse. And it probably will feel a little bit more poignant. I mean, you will have your Saturn return in that 2 to 3 year time frame. So it might make the topics of that house a little bit more important or necessary for you to make sure you've got that good foundation with them.
Awesome. And that takes us to all the questions that we had in there. So thank you so much for the great questions, folks. And I'm seeing some lovely feedback coming in for Kelly. So thank you so much. Anna
Thank
says,
you.
that was very thought-provoking, Kelly. Thank you. A fantastic tool, not only for self-awareness, but for consciously building a successful and solid life. Thanks, Anna or Anna.
Thank
And
you.
thanks, Ellen, for that. Ellen just says, thanks for answering my questions. Layla says, Kelly, you're a wonderful teacher, concise yet thorough. I agree. We love Kelly. Thanks,
Oh,
Layla.
thank you.
And Kim says, thank you, Kelly. I learned so much and thoroughly enjoyed your presentation. So thank you so much for all the
Thank
kind words,
you.
folks. Yeah. So you will find the recordings and the slides in your account later today, as always. And if you need any help with anything technical with the website, you can always email our support team, help@astrologyuniversity.com. They aim to respond within 24 hours to any questions that you have. And if you're taking this if you're taking this class through Kelly's website, same thing over there, but just help@kellysastrology.com. And we hope you can join us for Kelly's next course, which is Predicting with Progressions. It starts in September. It's part of a longer series she does on timing. So if you're totally new to timing, you might start with her course on transits and then jump into this, but you could just start with this one too. It's just a standalone course on progressions, and progressions is a topic that Kelly's passionate about, and she really is one of the best teachers on the subject. So if you've been mystified by progressions or just want to jump in and learn more, definitely encourage you to jump in on that one. You can find the details on our events calendar at astrologyuniversity.com/events. And Kelly, do you want to say a little bit about your monthly membership?
Yes, I would love to, because I keep forgetting to. So in addition to my regular training courses, I do have an Astrology Guide monthly membership, which is a look at all the current aspects. So if you're into timing, if you've come today because you love looking at astrology in daily life, then you might really enjoy the Astrology Guide membership, because in September, which is already, we'll be loading that into the membership site next week. I've already recorded all the content for September. I take you through every aspect that's happening each day and each month. Mars opposite Neptune, Mercury trine Saturn, the full moon, Mars changing signs. And I give you a little bit of insight and info about what to expect, what this aspect can mean, and how to navigate it in a day-to-day sort of situation. So it's really affordable. You can get a little bit of a discount if you commit to a whole year rather than signing up month by month. But if month by month is your preference, you can do that too. And if you pop over to my website, kellysastrology.com, and just scroll down a tiny little bit, you'll see a big banner that'll take you to that. If you sign up today, you can have all the content for August. It's in there. You can access that now, and September will be going up next week. 3 times a year or 4 times a year? 4 times a year, we do a live members Q&A where I jump on and just take questions and hang out with you all. So if you like astrology from a day-to-day perspective, this is for you. Hope to see you there.
Thank you for that. Kimberly says, testimony for your monthly membership, super great and informative. Don't let a month go by without tuning in. Awesome. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
And Tina, I did just drop in the link for you. So thanks for that. Well, with that, I'm going to say goodbye for now. We'll go ahead and stop the recording. And thank you so much, Kelly, for joining us today. We're really appreciative.
My pleasure. Thank you so much, Tony. And thank you for keeping us holding great space for Saturn so we could stay on time.
Awesome. We did it. Yes.
Have a great day, everyone.
You too. And until next time, take good care.
Bye.